Welcome back, everybody, to the 315 session of Flyover Tech Fest. We're joined now by Kyle Campbell, the CEO at CTO.ai, to talk about building 10x engineering teams outside of Silicon Valley.
Hey,
What's
man.
up, Kyle? How's it
Been
going?
too long. How are you doing? Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking
Doing
forward to this. Yeah.
absolutely. Really glad to have you on today, and a very exciting topic to talk about. One I know that you're extremely well versed in, and I'm so excited to let the world into your brain for 20 minutes here to learn
Oh,
about building a 10x engineering team.
that's a scary
So
proposition to get into my brain. All right, let's do it.
let's do it. So just quick, rundown. Tell us where you're at, what you're up to, what is CTO.ai, and just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, a little bit of backstory. Self-taught software engineer, high school dropout, learned on the internet. So I got a bit of a contrarian viewpoint when it comes to like the industry standard things that I think people often learn in engineering cultures. Been an entrepreneur for a young age, started a developer company in the real estate space, which is how we met. That was acquired by Zillow Group. And as part of that journey, it was quite hard to raise money, all the different things that you would expect at the seed stage. So one of the things I really had to do was rethink the paradigms of how to build an engineering team, especially outside of Silicon Valley, for leverage. And that's where I learned a lot of things that I carried into CTO.ai. And what CTO.ai is all about is trying to streamline the developer experience, the developer workflow, to get the highest leverage on software developers' time in a way that really meets the needs of the business. We think that there's about $300 billion lost in developer productivity every year. And it's a mixture of the technologies that developers are using have never been more complicated, but also the developer experience, the intuitiveness of what you need to work through in these technology paradigms are never been more complicated. But yet there's this broken feedback loop between what the business needs and what the developer needs. And product management sort of tries to fill that gap. But we take a real engineering-centric view of thinking about how to optimize the software developer workflow, how to improve collaboration and communication, especially in remote teams via our deep partnership with people like Slack. And we spent about 2 years building the company profitably, bootstrapping it. Recently raised a very large seed round from some great investors, including Slack, Tiger Global, and are now sort of trying to scale up to this big market opportunity that I just described. And trying to really embrace that sort of Silicon Valley mindset, but obviously without necessarily setting roots, especially from an engineering perspective in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I want to just kind of dive in, let people know, I know you very well. I know where you come from. I know how skilled you are as an engineer and as a founder and as a leader. Giving people a little backstory with some, ballpark numbers, like how many people are in your CTO community, CTO.ai community? How many engineers have you worked with over your past companies, your current company? Just give us an idea of the scale of engineers that you've worked with.
Yeah, so been software engineering for a long time. Like I said, since I dropped out of high school when I was 16, went right into the professional workforce and just sort of figured it out along the way. So I've worked with so many great engineers along the way, and that's really who I should give the credit to, because how else do you learn than through other people if you're not going to computer science and learning in that path, as well as the open source community. Over from sort of Retzley on, I'd say I've probably worked with over 100 engineers, which I had a hand in hiring into many different teams. Typically, I try to focus on smaller teams, higher leverage, rather than these larger teams. And so when we started CTO AI, the strategy originally was to work with these earlier stage startups and help them think through what are the things that they need to do to get their engineering teams running at breakneck paces so that they could go from C to Series A to B quickly and drive that. And so, typically across those, I'd say 100 or so engineers. I've done that across maybe 25 or so companies. So on average, teams that you're building in the 4 to 5 category. Some are bigger, some are maybe a little bit smaller, but typically, like what I find has always worked quite well in that sort of model is to start early and get a foundation set. And then that foundation carries forward as you hire and add new people. And I think one of the things that often I've seen across that is people wait too late to make some of these decisions. And therefore, my goal was always to try to get in earlier to businesses to be supportive. So yeah, I mean, we're not talking about thousands of people here. Definitely not the person who's going to give you advice about how to manage a P&L of 360,000 people. But what I'm really specialized in is helping early stage engineering teams use what I call lean DevOps and lean DevOps methodologies to create a high leverage on their time. And therefore it benefits the business because you're spending less time tackling technology problems and you're delivering more of the value that the customers want.
Mm-hmm. So I want to let you talk about, and I'm very curious to hear about what you mean by the lean DevOps approach with these early stage engineers. I think we have a lot of people in the audience now from kind of right in that perspective. And even still, if they're later stage, they're probably standing up different product teams who should abide by some similar principles. Kind of a two-part question. So you're an engineer by trade. Do you think this makes it easier or harder to be the CEO of a startup?
As an engineer?
Yeah.
I mean, it's easier for me because I can zoom in and zoom out. My pattern recognition is really well developed. And one of my greatest strengths is my ability to troubleshoot problems or thin slice problems and sort of use reasonable deduction to get to the highest probability outcome in order, and then work through it in order of what the chances are. And you can either do that when you're solving problems in firefighting, or you can do that when you're looking at things that are going to be the highest impact in your product roadmap. So that's something that's really, I feel is works really well for me. I think it can be challenging sometimes for engineers. And as a result, I mean, it can be challenging to work with a CEO who can also write code and knows at that level of depth the work that you're doing. So I really try to foster this idea of learning in public, where I'm pretty humble about my actual coding ability. I'm not that great of a developer, but trust me, I'll get it done on time. It'll scale, and we can refactor it later. And so I think that's one of the things that I've learned a lot about in the last couple of years is the better you can drive that sort of momentum where other people in your engineering team are also aligned with the value. And this is sort of the idea of the lean DevOps methodology, is getting that lean startup model ingrained into your engineering team from the beginning. The more you can do that, the more as a CEO, I can switch back to being just a founder. And when you're a founder, then you're definitely more part of the team. You're more expected to be involved in things. And so a lot of times I sort of say to my team, like, CEO, janitor, whatever you want to say, but like, let's work on this problem together, and let's, not be worried about what the right solution is so much as let's try to make decisions quickly based on, the information that we have, and find a solution that's going to be the highest leverage one possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. I know the lean startup approach is probably really similar to what you're doing with the lean DevOps approach and lean engineering approach. I kind of want to call out the elephant in the room. I know there was a lot of, at one point on Twitter, there was a lot of debate about, is a 10X engineer a thing? And I want to get your thoughts on that, since our title here is building 10X engineering teams outside of Silicon Valley. Do you think that, do you believe in such a thing as a 10X engineer? So what do they look like?
I do. I don't really buy into what they're described as in VC Twitter or in Silicon Valley, the HBO special. This disgruntled Carver engineer who just works by themselves and is pounding Red Bulls and does 10 times more work than everyone else. I mean, that person just makes everybody miserable, because there's such a walled garden and such an empire builder. And it becomes this person where they're doing all of this stuff and they become the bottleneck, and they're not prioritizing the broader team, right? So, I mean, when I talk about 10X engineering, what I'm talking about is one person who helps 5 other people be 2 times more productive, 2 times more successful, create 2X leverage on their experience. And for me, the way that I leverage that, especially at somewhere like Retzley, which is carried forward, is I actually looked for the right kind of talent. And to me, that was people who didn't come with these really preconceived notions of what right was. They may be experienced and have a lot of tools in their toolbox, but they're very open to evaluating different ways of doing it and looking for the one that's the highest leverage. And then what I always tried to do to be a 10X engineer myself and set that example was leverage this idea of DevOps, what I call lean DevOps, to create leverage on their time. So building out tools that help them streamline the work that they do. So if you take this idea of a 10X engineer and you combine it with the traditional idea of DevOps, the definition that I follow of DevOps is philosophy and best practices embodied or immortalized in tools. And the idea of tools is what's supposed to reinforce the philosophies, the best practices, which are essentially how we develop culture in engineering teams. I think a lot of times in DevOps, a lot of time in technical teams, we focus on the tools. We focus on the technology. We don't really focus on what is the thing that we're trying to achieve. And that's what Lean DevOps is really trying to speak to. And it's also why I'm trying to sort of talk about 10x engineering in a different way, because I think a lot of founders have this idea that they can just find that one rock star, that one ninja, things are going to get better. But the truth is, you bring that person in and they have all these opinions, all these ideas. But if there isn't that sort of high leverage team mindset, right? We're talking like, I'm Canadian. Let's talk about hockey teams, right? You go onto the bench on a hockey team. There's a little bit of competition on the bench, just like we're competing with the other team. But it's about prioritizing the team, and the highest leverage for the team is to score the goal. So how do you then find that person who doesn't come in and just do all the stuff and is always the one shooting the puck? I mean, Michael Jordan, for another sports analogy, you need to have Pippen and Rodman. We all know this, right? So how do you approach that? To me, it's setting clear philosophies and best practices in the form of some sort of measurable KPI, being really clear about how you measure the success of engineering, which I don't mean product. Product is story points, right? Engineering time is things like ship quickly and don't break it. The way we measure that in DevOps is lead time for change. How long does it take to get a change out the door? Deployment frequency. How rapidly are we able to deploy? That's a measurement of my velocity and how supported I am as an engineer. Deployment failure rate. How often am I deploying and things are broken? That might be an indicator that I'm not getting enough code review. It might be an indicator that the infrastructure isn't set up to be configurable or resilient. And mean time to recovery, meaning how quickly can I recover from a failure? I mean, if you really think about those 4 metrics, which were, I can't take credit for, this is, from the DevOps Research Association. They did great work on this. Thinking about how to apply those measurements into the tools, the culture, philosophy, and best practice, I think that's what it's about. And it's about keeping the tooling and the experience lean so that you're always able to refactor parts of the system quickly. Because the truth is technology actually gets less valuable over time in most organizations, because there's a negative correlation between how you add more technology and add more process and the efficiency of an individual developer. So keep it lean, manage that dichotomy is what I always try to say for engineering teams, and look for engineers who are not saying, here's how I'm going to go and build this solution and it's the right thing. Look for somebody who's going, okay, how can I make people more effective around me? How can I remove their barriers to entry so that they're more effective? When you do that, you commoditize your technology, meaning it's cost effective to run, and you make it easier to hire people who can be successful in your company.
Mm-hmm. I love all of that. I think one thing that kind of caught my attention there was your definition of DevOps. I can't remember exactly what it was.
That's not mine. That's AWS.
The definition of DevOps that you gave was something along the lines of the process memorialized by the tools and code and things that you're putting into place. That's really what CTO.ai does. Is that right? Everything you just talked about is essentially what's going into your company, your product.
Generally,
right?
that's the idea. What we saw as we worked through sort of all these different companies, all these early stages, everybody was building their own DevOps system. And sometimes they'd license in different tools, whether it's GitHub or whatever. And more we're getting to things that are, more standard here. But one of the things that you see is engineers will reinvent the wheel from first principle anytime they have the opportunity. And because DevOps is often something that is implemented too late in startups, it's this perfect opportunity for people to start adding automation, adding these things which are powerful, but only when it drives leverage for the entire team. So what we do is we come into companies, we instrument basically a workflow analysis tool where your different tools start sending us information. We start looking at your existing workflow, and then we use our experience having worked with many other companies and all the data that we've collected to say, hey, if you adjust your workflow in these ways, this is where we think you can get a higher point of leverage, because it's not about automating things. You can automate something that saves you 5 minutes. That's not very valuable for the business. But if it's something that's saving 2 or 3, 4, 5 hours a day for 10 engineers, whoa, okay, now we're removing a real human capital cost and creating a better experience for those developers where they're feeling better about delivering things quickly. And that's where the idea of the workflow comes in. And what we do is we offer these different types of workflow tools, which are just Docker containers, if you know what Docker is. And they run anywhere. They run in the CLI, they run in Slack. You write the logic, And you can basically do basic commands like your CLI, pipelines, which are build pipelines or data pipelines, and then even run web services on it. And because it's in Slack, it's kind of remote first, easily observable, keeps everybody in the loop. And when you hire new people, they don't have to go through this deep training on things like Kubernetes. They just go, oh, hey, that person went /ops run deploy. That's how I deploy my code to production. So crazy shocking rule that we aim for, my measurement of what good DevOps looks like is just ask any engineer on your first day here, were you able to deploy code to production? And if their answer is no, then there's room for improvement in the workflow.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard that time and time again from all sorts of leaders, is especially on the engineering product side, when someone comes in and you're training them, we had sessions all throughout the day about onboarding people, even especially in a remote first world today. Your engineers need to try and ship code the first day. It gets them through the entire process. And I absolutely love that. It's something we strive to do. And it's something that your product and your entire philosophy and community help to foster. So kind of switching gears to talk a little bit about, people ops, engineer ops. If there was one trait you could look for in a top engineer, what would it be?
Tenacity probably would be one. I think I think a lot of times the technical ability is important, but it's also in some regards table stakes if the organization is doing the right things to commoditize technology. And by commoditize technology, I mean Dan McKinley's famous for saying, choose boring technology. You only have 3 innovation tokens. Don't spend them on on your database. Spend them on some other differentiated thing, right? So to that regard, if you're choosing boring technology, that shouldn't be the thing that is really setting somebody apart or not often. Really what should be setting them apart is their sort of tenacity and their willingness to look past the technology and understand how the technology can serve a higher leverage aspect for their team or a higher leverage aspect for the business, or most importantly, somebody who is very customer centric, somebody who can understand, hey, how the customer feels, how they're thinking. I think those are the things that are far harder to hire for outside of Silicon Valley. And I think those are the things that I would prioritize highly. And if you can spend time commoditizing the technology and the tools and the workflows, now what you're focusing on is finding those people who have a real strong culture fit, a real strong personality fit. And the indicators that I look for a lot of times, obviously I always look at LinkedIn first. And the thing that I care about is what are the companies that you've worked with, and just generally getting a sense of, have you been at a company who is around this stage, and how are you going to feel around the challenges of being at a company at this stage? And there's different stages. And I think sometimes you want to hire for a stage appropriate sort of mindset. And then the second thing I look for is something like their GitHub. And what I want to see there is less about like code that you're committing on the job. And it's more like, how have you interacted with technology and technology teams that aren't necessarily on the job? And I know it's really hard to have this sort of expectation that somebody's doing open source or have a side project, but the strongest thing that I look for one of the key indicators I look for in there is a behavior of a willingness to contribute an idea into an open source community and then accept feedback. And if I can see that, that's a real strong indicator. If I can't see that, then there's a number of other different ways to start breaking down that person's willingness to learn in the open. But in seeing that, it's a strong indicator to me right off the bat that this person is somebody that generally should be stage appropriate and have sort of a willingness to learn in the open and isn't afraid about putting ideas out there and getting feedback on them. And I think that is probably the starting point. And then you start asking yourself, okay, how do they work with the team members around them in the business? How do they think about leverage? What are their sort of technology philosophies? Are those prioritizing leverage? I think those are the things that are really important in a startup. And then I think it's very different if you're in a larger organization. Management becomes a whole different can of worms. And typically when I'm hiring engineers, I'm not worrying about management. I'm more worrying about sort of this idea of leadership and drive and sort of, some level of tenacity and initiative that is having people follow those ideas, but also a willingness to beat the idea up and come out with the best idea without sort of getting into dogma, I guess is one way of saying it.
Mm-hmm. So pretty much, openness, willingness to contribute to open source, things like that. Tenacity and curiosity I think are really
Certainly.
big traits to summarize, a lot of those big engineering, and then table stakes for, just their technical ability. I love those things. Those are definitely things that we foster too. Flipping it back to you, engineers are extremely, extremely in demand roles right now. An engineer could go get any job that they want, especially if they meet all of those criteria that you just outlined.
Mm-hmm.
So what do the absolute best engineers in the world look for in a leader like you, like me?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm necessarily qualified to answer that, because I've hired some great engineers, but I think a big part of my philosophy is you don't have to be the best engineer in the world, and what does that even mean, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the kind of people that I want to work with, I think what they look for and what they would respect about me is I'm somebody who's going to have high standards and high expectations, and I'm going to challenge them constantly on how they're evaluating their technology decisions. And I'm going to look at it through the frame of how those things create leverage for the team and for the business. And I think the people who respond really well to that, what they respect is essentially a radical candor approach. Like it's not personal by any means. I'm not at all challenging your self-worth by saying that I don't think that this technology is the right decision, despite it may be the engineering right decision. Like if we're talking about engineering as in like building buildings and these kinds of things, but like in a software model, what I'm challenging you to do is think a little bit differently. And I think radical candor is really important there, because many times engineers can get very attached to the technology, and there's sort of this forest through the trees thing that you have to really be patient about. And I think being able to challenge the idea, but then take the time to say, okay, now let's think outside the technology. Let's think about how this technology impacts the business. I think that's a place where a lot of engineers can find a ton of growth. And I give every engineer the benefit of the doubt on that, because it's something that served me really well in my career. And I want to be able to offer that back to them. When you can understand both technology and how technology impacts business, you open up such a huge swath of things. And so I think sometimes people will get frustrated with me because I don't place as much of the emphasis on the technology as they'd like to expect, especially from someone wearing a CTO shirt, right? But really what I think I try to communicate and what I try to foster, and I hope the things that people who work with me would respect is the idea that technology is a tool, and it's a diminishing thing, that over time, certainly systems will get smarter. There'll be less code. Low code is already happening. So how do you start transcending that API and asking yourself how you create higher leverage beyond just writing code? And that's something that I will challenge people even at a junior level to consider in their career. And I've always been really fond of working with junior engineers, because they're very much willing to shape their perspective and be open to that. So it's a hard question. I'm not sure, but I would hope that those are the things that I can bring to the table. And I think the other thing is that most engineers want to know that the person leading them is very technically competent. I mean, I think that's really, really important. And it's something that helps make sure that people are willing to follow the technical decisions and then emphasize the business impact.
Mm-hmm. I think that's definitely a kind of an unspoken trait that I think people look for in great engineers look for in founders. The one last question I want to throw your way quick is, we've talked about getting the right talent, getting them to buy into you as a leader, what it actually, lean DevOps, what it actually takes to create a lean team. Those are all great, but like I said, engineers are extremely in demand folks right now.
Yeah.
How do you prevent them from leaving?
I don't think you should. I think like this is one of those things where if you have the right foundations and you have the right mindset, and you're constantly recruiting, and you're getting known within this engineering community as a place where people can come and learn and grow, I think that's really important. And I think that's the starting point, right? I think sometimes there's definitely people where you have to really dig in and make sure that they're supported. But I think there's other times where people ultimately are just going to grow, and the right thing for them is to move on to that next thing. Honestly, I had that experience with the company that I worked at, and the founder encouraged me to move on. I started Bretzley, here I am. That never would have happened. And so part of my philosophy on this is, where are these people moving on to? If they're moving on to the best companies in the world, well, I've done my job, right? And I'm sad to see them go. Absolutely, I am. That hurts. Trust me, it hurts. But the business needs to be resilient enough. The technology strategy needs to be resilient enough. If I've done my job commoditizing the technology enough, there should be no walled gardens, and there should be no excuse why the business fails if that person moved on. So we have this philosophy in engineering. It's called the bus factor. What happens if I get hit by a bus, right? There's also sort of this idea of chaos engineering, where you inject chaos and you see what happens with your system. I think when you think about people, if you're asking yourself that question of like, how do I make sure you don't leave, then like you've already lost in a lot of ways. And as long as these people are moving on to companies that are better than ours, that are more experienced than ours, that are moving them to their next level in their career, I think that's very much okay. I'd never stand between somebody and that. My job is to make sure that they're well supported and successful while they're with us. And if I do that job well, they're going to outgrow us potentially. You know, if I do it really well, they outgrow us. And the way I measure that is if they end up at these companies that I look up to, honestly, in some ways. Mm-hmm. Now, if they're ending up at the you know, place down the street that just is like not at all on the same program, then you got to ask yourself, were they the right fit? Are we doing something wrong? And these sorts of things, right? But if people are taking steps forward in their career, especially, you know, smart engineers who are in demand, I think you have to accept that and try to solve it on the other side by making sure that technology is commoditized. You have a strong onboarding and intake process, always be recruiting. And, you know, it's a challenge. So solve for it, not in the context of limiting people's growth. Try to, you know, enable that as much. And I think they will be appreciative of that, and they'll stay longer if you really do it well. I
think that is a refreshing perspective. I absolutely love that perspective. That is a great way to wrap up. I thank you so much, Kyle. That was insightful as always. I really hope that people can take away everything we talked about there, but especially that last point, even for myself, you know, I find myself thinking about that. It's just a different perspective on, you know, you've done your job, you've helped them move on, and that, you know, it's refreshing. So I really appreciate it, Kyle. Thank you so much for the time today. Hopefully everyone here has learned as much as I do every time I talk to you, it seems like. So thank you so much.
Quick shout out. Please come follow me on Twitter, Slayjax, or head over to CTO.ai. We have an open Slack community where we've got hundreds, now coming up on thousands of people talking about the developer workflow. We'd love to meet some people. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Definitely join that. Yeah. Thanks, Kyle. Appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.